So first of all, Yaakov was living in Mitzrayim for 17 years. God told him, you're going to stay there till you die. And right, till you die. And Joseph had said it's 5 more years of the famine, but we see that Yaakov's still there for an additional 12 years. This also may be one of the reasons that the family doesn't leave, because Yaakov is staying there. We try to figure out why don't they leave after the famine, but in fact, Yaakov cannot leave. He was told to stay there until he dies, so the family stays with him. But in any event, the 17 years is very interesting because we remember back in chapter 41, not 41, in chapter 37, that Joseph was 17 years old when he had the negative interactions with his brother that caused him to be sold. And it means that Joseph is with Jacob for the first 17 years of his life, and Joseph is with Jacob for the last 17 years of Jacob's life. And that's actually very interesting. The Torah clearly wants us to connect that. And the idea being, among other ideas perhaps, that the question of influence of Yaakov upon Yosef. Because Yosef left as a very young person. He's been in Mitzrayim his whole life. He's firmly ensconced. He's a position of great importance, etc. And we saw that. And now the question is to what degree Yaakov can exert some kind of influence on Yosef. That's going to be one of the main topics of the remainder of this book. Because Yosef, to what degree is Yosef a Jew? To what degree is Yosef an Egyptian? And we need Yosef to be included in the family. That was Jacob's dream, to build this bayit. Everybody gets included, but there's a question over here about Yosef, his own identity in terms of Mitzrayim versus Canaan, in terms of Mitzrayim versus Israel. And the other question is, still remains outstanding, is Joseph's relationship to his brothers. Has he truly forgiven them? Do they trust him, etc.? These are the questions that will emerge, but the Torah already sets it up. Jacob is in Egypt for 17 years. Fine. Now let's continue now. Vayikruvu Yemei Yisrael Amut. Vayikruv Nogi Yosef. Vayomer lo Imno Matzati Chen B'Einecha Simno Yodcha Tachat Yirechi Yosito Imodi Chesed V'Emet. So Yaakov calls Yosef, summons Yosef, and he has a request of Yosef. Please, he says, if I find favor in your eyes, it's a typical expression. Often the expression of one inferior position to one in a higher position, often in terms of God. Moshe requests of God, if I find favor in your eyes. So typically it's from someone on a lower station to a higher station. Joseph, after all, is the viceroy of Egypt. And Jacob is a foreigner. Yes, he is Joseph's father, but he requests of Joseph very politely. But he says, Simnoyot, put your hand under my thigh and do for me chesed v'emet. That's a very interesting term, chesed v'emet. It probably does not mean kindness and also truth, but it probably more means a true kindness. Like I said, shel emet. Do for me a great kindness, a true kindness, which is, don't bury me in Egypt. And he asked Joseph to commit himself to this. We all remember back in chapter 24 of Breshit, Avram is old, just as Jacob is old over here. And in chapter 24, beginning of chapter 24, he summons his servant. That's Avram in chapter 24. Let's just take a look at that for a moment. Beginning of chapter 24, in a parallel story, Abraham Zaken Bo Bayamim. Abraham is old in years. Hashem Beirachat Abraham Bakol, and Avram was blessed with everything. And then, Vayomer Abraham El Avdo Zakan Beito HaMoshe B'chor Shelo Sino Yotcha Tachat Yirechi. Put your hand under my thigh, summons his servant. He continues speaking. And I will impose upon you an oath. So the putting of the hand under the thigh, some kind of a commitment. But in addition, I want you to swear. I impose an oath. I will impose upon you an oath. Apparently the greater can impose the oath upon the lesser. This is his servant. someone he trusts completely, someone in charge of his affairs, but nonetheless, he's still Eved Avraham. So Avraham says, I'll make you swear, pose you upon you an oath by the God of heaven, God of earth, that that you will not take from my son a wife from the Canaanite, but rather, he says in the next verse, you will go back to my homeland, go back to my land from which I came, Aram, and take from my son a wife. Fine. The servant then raises the question, maybe she won't want to come, and Avram says no, and then that's not acceptable. If she doesn't want to come, you're exempt from the oath. You can't bring my son back over there. And the Torah then says later in verse number 9 of this chapter, so he put his hand under his thigh and he swore. That's the story we have in chapter 24. There again, someone is old and can't travel anymore. He's too old to travel. He traveled his whole life, can't travel. He has to rely on somebody else to do his bidding, his servant, and he does two things. He wants the servant to commit by putting his hand under his thigh, but at the same time he imposes the oath. And the two come together in verse number 9. He had put his hand under the thigh and he swore. That's what it says in chapter 24. Now let's get back to our chapter 40, end of chapter 47. So Yaakov says to Yosef, Simna yotcha tachat yirechi. And I'm telling you, I don't want you to bury me, and I don't want to be buried in Egypt. I'll not tikbureni b'Mitzrayim. V'shachavtiyim avotai. Rather, in verse number 30, when I die, unesatani mi Mitzrayim, carry me out of Egypt, ukvartani b'kfuratam, and bury me in their grave, there being his ancestors, right? His Avram, Yitzchak, his mother, his father, his mother, etc., right? In their grave. Im avotai, with my ancestors. Vayomar, and Joseph says, Anochi esekid barecha, and Joseph says, I will do this. He commits to his father, I will do it. And then we have the next verse, which is very striking. Vayomer, Hishavali. So Yaakov says to Yosef, I want you to swear. Vayishavalo, and he swears. Vayishtachu Yisrael Rosh Hamita, and Jacob bowed at the head of the bed. So the question, of course, is obvious, which is, Joseph has already said, I will do it. And it sounded like he may even have put his hand under his thigh. It's possible, some kind of a commitment. Then why is it necessary to say to Yosef, swear? In the first story, the parallel story, the putting the hand under the thigh and the swearing comes together. There's a conversation exactly what the evidence is expected to do. And then at the end, he puts his hand under the thigh and he swears. But over here, the text is broken up because in the middle of it, Joseph says, I will do as you say. He commits to his father to do what the father has requested, namely, not to bury him in Mitzrayim and to bring him back to the ancestral grave, the kever of Avotai, of my ancestors. Why is it necessary to make him swear? He already said he's going to do it. Isn't he good for his word? Does he trust him or not? This is the question. So I think there are two different approaches here. I'll suggest two different approaches to this question, to resolving this problem as to why after he says, I'll do it, he still makes him swear. One of them has to do with the question whether in fact he will do it. And already the Mefarshim, Midrashim, Mefarshim pick up on this because the point is that, yes, he is committed to doing it, but we can foresee a possibility that it might not be so simple to carry this out. Yes, he is the viceroy of Egypt. He's the second in command, but there's somebody who's first in command, namely Paro, and it could be that Paro will not be very anxious to permit the father of a very important dignitary to be carried out of the land of Mitzrayim. And in point of fact, we do know that when you get to chapter 50, where Yosef wants to bury his father, He can't even speak directly to Paro to make the request. He pleads with the servants to speak to Paro for him. And Paro said in chapter 50, Aleu kvar et avicha kasher ishbiecha. Go and bury your father as he made you swear. So it sounds like the oath is very important to Paro. He emphasizes the oath. So in point of fact, that could be a reason. In other words, because, Yosef could perhaps rationalize it. Yosef could say, I know my father wanted me to bury him in the land of, not in the land of Egypt, and to go back to the Me'arat HaMachpelah, to the ancestral grave. But look how difficult it is. Paro's giving me all kinds of problems, and Paro's be very dangerous for us. And my father would understand if I say, well, I know I really want to do it, but given the circumstances, father would understand me not carrying out his request. So father, Jacob says to Joseph, swear. In other words, father will not understand. Father would want me to do X. No, that's not true. Father wants you to bury me in the land of Canaan under every circumstance, and there's no excuses. So that could be one reason for the oath. So the oath is a way that's how some of the Mepharshim see it. The oath is a way to make it more likely, first of all, that Paro will in fact agree. And it also, I would add, maybe they don't suggest this, but it makes it, maybe they do, it makes it, it gives Yosef a frame of mind where the thing has to get done. Because that's what the shvur means, you have to do it. There's no such thing in the Bible of taking an oath and not keeping the oath. The idea of hatarat nidarim, someone get out of an oath or a vow that one made, is, in the words of the Mishnah, floats in the air and has no basis in the text. Because in all of the Bible, there's only one case I can think of where somebody took an oath and it wasn't carried out. And that was Saul's oath that whoever ate food on the day of battle will in fact be killed, will die, will be guilty of a crime and put to death. And Jonathan didn't know about this oath. He's off by himself, actually fighting, and he eats. Goes to the forest of honey and he eats. And it turns out that Saul finds out that Jonathan, in fact, did eat. It wasn't intentional, he didn't know. But he says Jonathan should die. Jonathan violated the oath. And in that instance, and only in that instance, the people said to Saul, what? How could you kill Jonathan? He brought about the whole redemption, and they prevent Saul from carrying out his oath. Saul would have done it, would have killed his beloved son. He would have done it. And that's the only example we have. You take an oath, you keep your oath. That's the story of Yiftach, basically. It was crazy, but Yiftach took an oath, a foolish one. Whoever comes to greet me shall be a sacrifice. And his only child, his daughter, came. And it sounds like he actually sacrifices her. That's what it sounds like. So oath means you keep your oath. Hatarat nedarim and all that, the Gemara itself says, the Mishnah says, floats in the air, has no basis. So when you say to Joseph, swear, it means do it in any event, no matter what. And this way, it also will serve as a way to convince Paro. Paro spoke about God. Paro talks a religious language. So he'll understand. You take an oath, you keep the oath. That's one path. That's one way to understand this, that the issue is actually the imposition of the oath is a way to guarantee that what Yaakov wants will actually happen. They suggested a couple of reasons that might not happen. Basically, the idea is Joseph can't rationalize it. Plus, he gives a weapon to Joseph to convince Paro to permit it. That's one path. Then there's another path, which is not about convincing Joseph or not thinking Joseph might not do it. Joseph has said, Father, I will do it. Anochi yasekid barecha. And Yaakov trusts him. He said he's going to do it. He's going to do it. It could be difficult. He'll do it. If it's impossible, he can't do it. If Paro says you can't do it, the army prevents it from going, he won't be able to do it. Under any other circumstance, Joseph will do it and Yaakov trusts him. But the oath is a different point over here. It's not so much about convincing Joseph, or it's about teaching Joseph that what he's saying over here is something else. My return to the land after my death is done through an oath. It's not just I want to be buried with my parents and grandparents. It's not just family. It's something else. I see my return to the land as a sacred obligation. And here we touch upon something that is very central in the Torah. We remember that when Yaakov first leaves home, he's running away from his brother, and God appears to him in a dream and says, I'm going to protect you. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm going to bring you back. And we thought Yaakov's going for a short period of time. His mother said, I'll call you in a few days. And we come to understand it's not a few days. It's not going to be simple to return. It's going to require divine intervention and divine providence. And when Yaakov wakes up, what does he do? Vayidar Yaakov neder. He takes a vow. So the return to the land, he vows that if God allows it to happen, he will return. And the same thing is true later. God takes a shvua, right? God swears to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov to give them the land. And later in the book of Bamidbar that we're just starting to read, there's a story of the first war against the king of Arad, and Israel took a vow, the neder. To return to the land is through the oath and through the vow, which means, what is an oath? An oath is the imposition of God's name. So Yaakov is saying to Yosef, in effect, you're going to do it. But let me explain something to you about returning to the land. It's not just about parents. It's not just about that. There's something else for Yaakov, that returning to the land is a religious obligation. Mitzrayim is a contradiction to everything that Yaakov believes, which is this connection to God, the dream of Yaakov, the ladder to heaven. That's where God speaks. That's where God is present. He's saying to Yosef something else by implication, which is the return to the land is through the shvua. My return is, I want you to understand that. And I want to impose the oath upon you. And we all remember, of course, at the very end of this book, which we're not going to get to in this set of classes, but the very end of the book is Yosef telling his brothers, the very end of the book, remarkably, after I die, take my body back, my bones back with you to the land of Canaan. Take me with you. And what does Yosef do? He makes them swear. Vayashba Yosef. He imposes an oath upon them. So Joseph is a very good student. He does exactly what his father did to him, is what Yosef is saying to his brothers. Take me back. I impose upon you an oath to bring me back to the land of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So these are two different approaches over here for the need for Yaakov to impose the oath. And in point of fact, they don't actually contradict. I believe they're both true. That is, one has nothing to do with the other. It could be that he's giving Joseph a weapon to ensure that it happens. It could be he's telling Joseph it's got to happen no matter what, no rationalizations. But on top of that, he's saying something additionally, which is to return to the land is via the oath, is via the shvua, right? So the vow and the oath, because it's a sacred obligation. Okay, let me stop here for a moment and take comments or questions of what we've seen so far.
Feel free to unmute yourself to ask a question or ask it in the chat and I will read it out.
Maybe that's why Yosef uses the phrase pakod yifkod.
But pakod yifkod we'll get to, but pakod yifkod has to do with recognition. Yeah, pakod can mean redeem. Yosef comes to realize by the end of the book that we need to be redeemed. And it's the opposite of what he said earlier. He named his son Menashe.
Right.
He wants to forget his father's house. And by the time the book ends, he's the one who's lecturing the brothers. It's remarkable. He lectures them. Etc. So that's for sure. Now, how that transformation takes place, we'll talk about. Yaakov has a lot to do with it, obviously. Not just Yaakov, but Yaakov has a lot to do with it. But yes, Yosef comes to that understanding.
But I mean, that becomes like the password of going forward.
Right, that's the medrash. That later on, Moshe goes to Mitzrayim and says, "Pakod yifkod." Right. But for sure, I mean, Yosef is the one who sets it up. There's no question about it. And Yosef's learning from Yaakov, basically. What Yaakov's really saying over here. He's saying two things. I don't want to be here, he says. Number one, in Mitzrayim. And number two, I want to be there. Two separate statements. It can't be here. But on top of that, I want to go back to Kivot Avotai. And then I claim he's saying more than that, because that is the religious center. and you return to it through the oath. You return to it through it, but the oath is the imposition of God's name. You return to it through the imposition of God's name. That's our mission, to live in God's shadow and to do God's bidding, and to hear what God has to say. They give communication, which does not take place in Mitzrayim. It's a place of God's silence. So we got to get back to a place where we can hear God's voice. Anybody else for a comment or question? If not, we'll just continue. Okay? So let's start with chapter 48 now. Go as far as we can go. We're at chapter 48. Vayihi achar hadvarim ha'eleh. Vayomer Yosef hinei avicha choleh. Vayikach et shnei banav imo et Menashe et Ephraim. So afterwards, sometime afterwards, achar hadvarim ha'eleh. By the way, that expression, achar hadvarim ha'eleh, appears in this book 6 times. 6 times we have that expression, achar hadvarim ha'eleh. It's actually very interesting where it appears. It appears 3 times in the Abraham story, 3 times in the Abraham narrative, and 3 times in the Joseph narrative. It's interesting. Through connection of Yosef and Abraham is something to talk about. We discussed it a little in the past. In any event, after these things, someone said to Joseph, your father is ill. We know earlier it said, Vayikvu yimei Yisrael lamut, in a couple of verses earlier. So his death is imminent or near. And Joseph is told, your father is sick. So he goes to see him, but he also takes with him his 2 sons to see their grandfather, presumably. We don't know why he brings his 2 sons. I mean, we're going to find out why the Torah tells us he brings his 2 sons, but presumably to see his grandfather. He's sick, and he wants the grandchildren to see their grandfather. Joseph reveres his father. That's clear. He brings his 2 sons, Menashe and Ephraim. Okay, Menashe is the oldest, and Ephraim is the youngest son, of which the Torah has told us nothing at all except their names and reasons for the names. Okay. Vayaged Yaakov. So someone, again, doesn't matter who it is, Jacob is informed, Vayomer, Hinei bincha Yosef bo'elecha, your son Joseph is coming. Vayitchazek Yisrael, Vayeshev al Hamita. So Israel straightened himself and he sat up in the bed. So he's sick, he's lying in bed. When he hears that Joseph is coming, Vayitchazek, he says he summons his strength and sat up in bed. What is this idea of summoning his strength, actually? What is the point of that? It seems like if Torah hadn't said it, it's completely superfluous. Could have said Jacob told he's coming, and then the whole thing. You don't even need that. Could have started with the next passage. Yaakov says to Yosef, starts talking to Yosef. So I'll just suggest one thing about the Vayitchazek Yisrael, Vayeshev Ahamitah, is the Torah's way of saying that he's about to say something extremely powerful to Joseph, something that requires a lot of strength. He's going to tell him things that are not so simple to tell. And this is almost, I mean, Jacob doesn't die yet. He will bless in this chapter, and he bless all his sons in the next chapter. But there's something about here that requires kind of chizuk. We'll see what it is. Summons up his strength. He sits up in bed. Before that, I want to mention, I forgot one other point I wanted to mention about the previous story. After he says to Joseph, swear to me. That's the last verse of chapter 47. I want you to swear. Vayishavalo. And Joseph does swear. Vayishtachu Yisrael arosh hamita. So Israel bowed at the head of the bed. So Israel is Yaakov. So when Joseph does this, Yaakov bows at the head of the bed. Sounds like he bows to Joseph. And here's what's interesting is if we remember Joseph's dream back in chapter 37, second dream. The second dream was the sun and the moon and 11 stars will bow down to me. At that point, Yaakov rebukes Joseph. And what is this dream you're dreaming, says Yaakov to Yosef in chapter 37. Me and your mother and all of us are going to bow down to you. And the brothers were jealous. But in the dream, Yaakov interprets the dream. Yaakov says, the dream must mean the sun, the moon, and the stars, 11 stars bow down. The 11 stars are your 11 brothers. I got to be the sun. S-U-N. I'm the sun. What, do you think I'm going to bow down to you? So the brothers were jealous, but Jacob remembered the dream. Rashi comments, just remembered it and actually wanted it to take place. So where does it take place? Where does Jacob bow down? So Jacob bows down over here in our verse. Vayishtachu Yisrael lo shamita. Sounds like he's bowing to Joseph. He could be bowing to God in appreciation for God enabling this to happen. That's possible. But in the context, it sounds like he's recognizing what Joseph did. He bows down. And the point I wanted to make about that, if we assume he's bowing to Joseph, the point is that there's it's kind of ironic in a sense. Normally when you bow down to somebody, you're saying to them, you are superior to me, I'm grateful for you, etc., etc. It's always the inferior bowing down to some kind of superior, whether it's a person in important standing in government or whatever, or God, obviously. But over here, the context is very curious because, yes, it's true that Yaakov bowed down to Yosef, but the context of it is he's telling Joseph, the viceroy of Egypt, listen, under no circumstance am I to be buried over here. And not only that, I want you to do this. Father, I will do it. Really? Now swear. That's hardly the inferior talking to the superior. He's telling you what to do. He's bossing you around. He's imposing an oath. We impose on your servant. So yes, it is his bowing down to Joseph, but the bowing down is in the context, not of the one of the lower station bowing down to the higher station. But the whole point of it is that this old fellow is telling his important son exactly what to do. In appreciation for the fact that he in fact does swear, he bows down to him. That's so that you have a fulfillment of the dream, but not in the way we anticipate. It's a fulfillment of the dream for Joseph exceeding to the wishes of his father. Okay, just want to make that point. Now we'll get back to our story over here. So Yaakov is told, Yaakov strengthens himself. And now, beginning in chapter 48, verse number 3, we have some of the more remarkable psukim in this book. Suddenly, when Yaakov begins to talk to Yosef about the past. He tells Joseph about what happened to him in the past. And he says, beginning in verse number 3, Vayoma Yaakov el Yosef, El Shaddai nira elai beluz b'eretz Canaan vayevarech oti. Says Joseph, a long time ago, God, and the particular name of God over here is El Shaddai. Of course, the names of God are very significant, but the names of God all have particular valence to them, a particular meaning to them. And he says over here, the God who appeared to me in Luz, back in the land of Canaan, who blessed me, was El Shaddai. And in point of fact, what Yaakov is saying to Yosef is pretty much explicit in the Chumash. We take a look at chapter 35. In chapter 35, beginning in verse number 9 of chapter 35, there it says that God appeared to Yaakov again when he returned from Padan Aram, from the house of Laban, Vayevarech otam, and God blessed him. And what did God say to Jacob in verse number 10? Vayomelo Elohim shimcha Yaakov. Your name is presently Jacob. Lo yikarei shimcha od Yaakov. No longer shall you be called Jacob. Kiyim Yisrael yeyesh shemecha. Vayikra shemo Yisrael. Israel shall be your name, and God called him Israel. So that's by way of introduction. So you're not just Jacob, you're Israel. And now the next verse. Vayomelo Elohim ani El Shaddai. And God said to Yaakov, I am El Shaddai. pray ureve, be fruitful and multiply. Goyu kahal goyim yiyem mimeka, umlachim mechalotzecha yetzeu. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and the company of nations shall descend from you. Kings shall issue from your loins. And the next verse, we have Ta'aretz Asher Natati, we have Rahamu Yitzchak L'choetnena. I will the land I promised Abraham and Yitzchak I'll give to you and to your descendants after you. Those are the psukim in chapter 35. He would, upon returning from the house of Lavan. And now Yaakov talks to Yosef and cites that whole episode over here. He's actually telling Yosef it's almost the same language with some interesting variations. Come back to our verse. Yaakov says to Yosef, El Shaddai appeared to me in Luz and blessed me. Vayomer Elai, and this is what God said to me back in chapter 35. Hineni mafrecha b'hirbitecha. I will make you fruitful and multiply you. The language over there was pray ureve, almost identical language. Unitatichu ikal amim. Over there, the language was goyu kahal amim yemi meka. And then I will give you this land to your descendants as a permanent possession. There, the language was it's almost as if Yaakov is just quoting the Chumash. He's quoting the Chumash. He's telling Yosef what happened, and you look back at it, and the language is very, very, very similar with some interesting differences. Now, why is he saying all this? So he's saying all this because of verse number 5 that we're about to read. Namely, he's saying to Yosef, and now I'm going to interpret for you what God said to me back in chapter 35. Yaakov here is a parshan. He's actually interpreting the Chumash. He's interpreting the words of the Torah. I might say he's interpreting his own life. Because what did God mean? When God said to me, pray ureve, be fruitful and multiply a nation, a company of nations, what did that mean? So now Yaakov is going to interpret this. I want to interpret for you, Yosef, what God said to me in chapter 35. I believe he's not just interpreting for Yosef, I believe he's interpreting for Yaakov. In other words, he's saying something to Yaakov, which is not actually clear when you first read it, is the plain meaning at all. But here's what Yaakov says. Here's my understanding now of what God told me earlier. I want to talk more about this because this is very central feature of Yaakov. One of the great abilities of Yaakov to kind of reinterpret his own life. Now he says the following: V'yata. So now, Shnei bonecha anoladim lucha b'eretz Mitzrayim ad b'li elecha Mitzrayim olihem Ephraim u'Mnashe kiruven v'Shimon yiyuli. So here's the first thing he says. When God said to me, "Be fruitful," I came back from the house of Laban. Comes back with 11 sons and a daughter. The only one not yet born was Binyamin, who's born a few verses afterwards. Now, so what does it mean? Be fruitful and multiply a nation, and the company of nations I will make from you. What does that mean? So Yaakov says what it means is Ephraim u'Mnashe kiruven v'Shimon yiyuli. My understanding now of what God meant when God said, "Be fruitful and multiply, have more children." Because he doesn't have more children; he has one more child. He has Binyamin. So what did God mean? Goyu kahal goyim, a nation and a company of nations will emerge from you. There must be more children, but there are no more children. So Yaakov, now I understand what God meant. God meant that your two children are actually mine. Ephraim u'Mnashe kiruven v'Shimon yiyuli. These two kids of yours, the ones born before I got here, before I came, those are my children. The ones that are born afterwards, but the ones born afterwards, they're yours. They'll be included in the inheritance of their brothers. I'll talk about that later. But in short, leave that out of the ones born afterwards. We don't actually have mention of Joseph having other children. He may have had children. Ramban thinks he had other children, but the Chumash doesn't tell us about the other children. It tells us about Ephraim and Menashe, That's Yaakov. Yaakov says Ephraim and Menashe. Notice when Joseph brings them, it says he brings Menashe and Ephraim. The order's already been shifted over here. When Yaakov talks, Ephraim and Menashe are my children. In other words, what did we think originally, before we knew about Ephraim and Menashe, when you read chapter 35? When God said to Jacob, be fruitful and multiply a nation, and the company of nations shall emerge from you. We don't know about Menashe and Ephraim. So what did we think? Well, I'll tell you what I thought anyway. What I thought it meant was this. Maybe Yaakov thinks this. Who knows? But just before God says to Yaakov, I am El Shaddai, just before that, the psukim before that say, your name is not Jacob anymore. Your name is Israel. Vayikra Shemo Yisrael, and God called Jacob Israel. So my understanding is that what God is saying to Yaakov is, you are not just Jacob, but you're Israel. Israel can mean you are Israel, but the name Israel is also the name of the Jewish people. The nation is Israel. We are Bnei Yisrael. So I thought it meant, when I first read it, that God says to Yaakov, you're not just the individual Jacob. You're the individual Israel, but you're also the people Israel. And in that sense, you will be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall emerge from you. God is not talking about Jacob, the person, anymore. God is talking about Jacob, who represents all of Israel. That is to say, you are Israel. You're going to become a nation, and this nation will grow and multiply. And within this nation, there shall be a nation and the company of nations. I think that's the plain meaning of it. There are no more children. There's Binyamin. But now Yaakov says something different. Maybe Yaakov says, that's what I thought the pshat was earlier. But now I've come to recognize at the end of my life, looking back at that event when God changed my name, that God has something else in mind. And that's the continuation in verse number 7, which I want to read, and I'll stop and take comments or questions. Then he says something very strange. It says, Vani bivawimi padan, and when I came back, Meto alai Rachel b'eretz Canaan baderech. Rachel died upon me. His beloved Rachel dies in the land of Canaan, baderech, on the path. B'yot kivrat eretz lavo Ephrata, a short distance from Ephrat. And I buried her there on the path to Ephrat, Beit Lechem, which is now Beit Lechem, Bethlehem. So the question is, and Rashi asks the question basically, why is Yaakov saying this over here? Why is Yaakov telling Yosef that when they came back from Padan Aram, that Rachel died and I buried her on the path? First of all, so why is it? What's the relevance of that? Rashi says that what Yaakov is saying to Yosef is the following. In the earlier conversation, the end of chapter 47, I asked you not to bury me in Mitzrayim, to bring me back to the grave of my ancestors. So now Rashi says, and I did that. I want you to know, by the way, that your mother's not buried there. Nonetheless, she wasn't buried there because she died on the derech. I couldn't take her there. She died on the path. So I had to bury her where she died. So I buried her there a little distance from Beit Lechem. But nonetheless, I still request of you that bury me there because the rest of my family, including Leah and my parents and grandparents, are all buried there. That's what Rashi says. The difficulty with Rashi is obvious, which is, without the actual pshat over here, why is Yaakov saying it in chapter 48, verse number 7? It belonged back in chapter 47. He could have said, listen, don't bury me in Mitzrayim, take me back there. I know your mother died, your mother's not buried there. Nonetheless, I still make the request. Please honor my request. I did that because, and you may know where she's buried or may not know, but it's because she died on the derech. She died suddenly on the path, on the derech, so I had no choice. But here we have a choice. So I ask you to bury me back with my ancestors. That's what would have made a lot of sense. But it doesn't seem to make very much sense to mention it over here, just after Yaakov has said to Yosef that God blessed me because the death of Rachel was a few verses afterwards in chapter 35. She gives birth to Binyamin, she dies in childbirth. And that's what Yaakov is referencing over here. So what's the connection? So here's what I would suggest about the connection, which is the following. What Yaakov says to Yosef is this. God spoke to me in chapter 35 and gave me a blessing. God said, like the commandment, pray urave, be fruitful and multiply. Here God says over here in the previous verse, Hineni mafrecha v'hir biticha. That's in chapter 48. That's in verse number, 6 or 5 or 6, right? Right here. Mafrecha v'hir biticha. And then a very strange thing. Be fruitful and multiply. Sounds like have more children. And then my wife dies. Now she dies in childbirth. So she's not going to have more children. She has one child. She has Binyamin. She's probably already pregnant with Binyamin too. So what did it mean, says Yaakov, when God said, pray urave, to have more children? I couldn't figure that out. It can't be me personally, because how could I have more children? My beloved wife just died. Says Yaakov, no. Here's how I come to understand it. That Rachel in her death will have more children. Because where did Rachel die? Where did Rachel die? He says she died, the old Kivrat Eretz, but she died on the path. But where? The old Kivrat Eretz Lavo Ephrata. She dies in Ephrat. So what a strange place to die. Because what does Ephrat mean? Ephrat presumably is related to the word Mafrecha v'hir biticha. She dies in a place called, she died in infertility. What? What does that mean? She dies in Ephrat. Says Yaakov, now I understand it. That what God must have meant was that Rachel will have more children, even in her death. How could she have more children? So the answer is she can't have more children, but she has grandchildren. And these two grandchildren of Rachel, those children are mine. It's remarkable what he's saying. Kiruven v'Shimon yuli. These are now my children, not your children. These are my children. And this actually suggests something further, which of course is very central to the story. You have Mafrecha v'hir biticha, you have Prei Urevei in chapter 35, you have the death of Rachel, his wife, in Ephrat, and now we come to understand something else. Yaakov favors, of the two sons of grandchildren of Yaakov and of Rachel, the one Yaakov favors is in fact Ephraim, as opposed to Menashe. But Ephraim and Ephrat are, Ephraim and Ephrat, of course, are obviously related to each other. So Yaakov is interpreting his own life in light of what I now see, says Yaakov. I come to understand that Rachel is the one who's going to have these additional children. These are her grandchildren, which I adopt as my children. That's point number one. Now there's something else over here, which is very important in terms of what Yaakov is doing. With the emphasis over here, in terms of Rachel, is Meito Rai Rachel Baderech. She died Baderech, on the path. And he says, I buried her there Baderech, Baderech Ephrat, he Beit Lechem. So what is the focus on Baderech over here? So what I would say is the following. Rachel died on the path. Why did Rachel die? So presumably Rachel dies because she stole these trophim. Yaakov, in fact, had said, whoever took them should die. Whoever took the trophim should die. And by that, Yaakov means, or the Torah means, not just because he said those words, because how could you possibly return to the land of Canaan, go to Beit El, right? Yaakov in chapter 35, let's go back to Beit El. How can you go to Beit El if you have trophim? In fact, remember in chapter 35, Yaakov says to the family, remove all of the idols. So now the question is, how does one view Rachel? You can view her in two different, you can see Rachel as a sinner. Okay, she stole the trophim, she's connected to Lavan in some profound way, and she dies by derech. That's one way to read it. But there's another way to read it, which I would say is a more generous reading. She was on the road back. She was by derech. She was on the road back. She was moving in the right direction when her life was cut short. What Yaakov is choosing to do over here is to view Rachel this the second way. As she dies by derech means she was on the path back. And Yaakov sees his own role as making sure that Rachel was fully a part of the family. Remember, Yaakov's mission, as he himself presents it, is to build the bayit. So the problem the part of the Bayit that seems to be most distant from his conception of God's house would be the side of Rachel. She stole the Trofim. Then you have Yosef, who is in Mitzrayim, the Egyptian, and even Binyamin, who was born, but Rachel named Binyamin Ben Oni, the son of my Oni, which I think means son of my iniquity, son of my sinfulness, son of the Trofim. But Yaakov changed the name. My son can't be Ben Oni. So he becomes Binyamin, son of my right hand. So what Yaakov is doing over here, and that's the reason Yaakov has to be in Mitzrayim, is to bring back that entire side of the family, including Rachel, whom he chooses to view positively. Yes, Rachel will have more children. Rachel's part of the family. Yes, she did die, but it was Baderech. She was on the way back. And of course, Yosef will be included as well, as we shall see shortly, how Yaakov managed to do that. But more than that, I think what makes this a very powerful story, as far as I'm concerned, is Yaakov's ability to reinterpret his own life, which he actually does earlier, because he's 20 years in the house of Laban. And those 20 years, he works 14 years for the 2 wives and the children. Then he works 6 additional years to make a living, and he makes a fortune. He manages to manipulate all the flocks. He's extremely wealthy. And then he recognizes, and God tells him time to get out. And Yaakov is confronted by Laban. And Yaakov says to Laban at the end of the conversation, let me describe these 20 years. For these last 20 years, I've been an Eved. And for the last 20 years, I've been oppressed. And then he leaves and goes back home. And Esav is coming. And he sends a message in Lavan Garti. I was a stranger in the house of Lavan. In other words, what Yaakov is saying, that was never my place. Now, if he asks Yaakov in the middle of those 6 years where he's raking in the money, he might not say, it's not my place. Or when he has his dreams about the speckled and the spotted animals, his dreams are about his bank accounts. But after he leaves, he looks back at it, says, you know something? That wasn't me. That's not my mission. That's not my place. So Yaakov's great ability is to reinterpret his past. And that's what he's doing over here in this right remarkable pasuk. Instead of psukim, he's saying, I now come to understand what God meant. My whole life I didn't understand it, but now I understand it. I understand what it meant, pray or revey. I understand how that has to happen. I understand the significance of Rachel's death and where she dies, not just by Derech, but next to Ephrat. And I'm going to act upon this. So I'm going to bring Rachel back into the family. I'm going to bring Joseph back into the family. But how will Joseph be brought back into the family? He'll be brought back into the family through Ephraim and also through Manasseh, through Joseph's children and Jacob's grandchildren and Rachel's grandchildren. Joseph can be fully incorporated back into the family. And yes, the kids who were born before I got down here, these 2 Egyptian boys, they got to become mine. I'm going to make sure they're mine, and I can't trust you with this. So I've got to do it myself. I am hereby adopting, Joseph, your 2 children as mine. That's why it says, Vayitchazek Yisrael vayeshav al mitah. The chutzpah has no bounds over here, but it's necessary. They're not yours. They're my children. Now later Jacob returns them to Joseph. That's what he says. So the ones born afterwards, they were going to be okay. I'll leave that for now and maybe talk about that next week. But okay, so let me stop at this point to take any comments or questions. These are quite remarkable psukim, actually. Okay, comments or questions, anybody?
We have a few questions from Ozzy in the chat. I think at the end of chapter 27, correct me if I'm wrong, Ozzy. Ozzy said, it reminds me of King David summoning his strength to designate Solomon as his successor. And he also says, Joseph was given Shechem. So who of Joseph's descendants lived in Shechem?
Joseph being given Shechem, we'll get to later on. That's the end of the chapter. It's not clear, actually. Yes, the town of Shechem is in Joseph's section. Shechem actually, and that's where Joseph is buried. He's actually buried in Shechem. As far as the story of King David mustering his strength at the end the stories have some parallel to them. Of course, they're different in many ways, obviously. That's a much darker story, but for sure. And by the way, that story about King David, well, that's one of the two Haftarot that's related to Parshat Vayechi and Chayei Sarah. So that's true. The person who's old, who has to muster the strength at the end to come to make a good decision. There is that parallel there for sure. What else do we have?
We have a question from Ben, also in the chat. This discussion brings up a question that has always puzzled me. Why doesn't Yaakov move Rachel's bones to Marat HaMachpelah? Is it because you are now explaining that there is something special about her staying on the road, as her destiny as a progenitor is not yet complete until Yosef's children are claimed? Or is it because two sisters can't be buried in the same place?
Okay, so that's the Ramban. So what Ben is mentioning is the Ramban. The Ramban addresses this question, and the Ramban puts it in terms of the two sisters. It's explicit. The Ramban asks this question on the Parsha, and the Ramban says that because they're two sisters, and Jacob couldn't be married, later it becomes forbidden, so he didn't want that to be, in this sort of a national shrine to have two sisters buried there. I mean, the other point is that the way, in Rosh Hashanah we read the Haftarah about Rachel Mevaka Abonera, that there's something about Rachel not being buried there. Something about, that's the prophet Yirmiyahu sees it that way, that her being Baderech is significant because she's the person who doesn't have a place. I'll tell you something. Let me just take 2 minutes aside to relate to the question, which is an important question, obviously. I was just reading a book recently. I just got in the mail a book. His name is Josh. I think his first name is Truba, who did some teaching for Drisha in Israel. He wrote a book about Rav Kook and Rav Shagar. And in this book, he talks about what their contribution. He talks about particularly Shagar is different from Rav Kook. And one of the points that Shagar made was actually a very important person, was the idea of Shagar. In the early history of Israel, once the state was established, and maybe even before that, there was certainly a real sense of many Israelis that we want to forget the past. We want to forget our experience in exile. We want to forget the Shoah. Jews were weak. It was a negation of the Golus in a very deep sense, and of all that, basically most of our history. And it was the idea of we are a new Jew, with a strong Jew, with a powerful Jew, etc. It was and what Shagar was pushing for, he was the Rosh Yeshiva and Siach in many places, very important voice. And he was pushing for something very different, which is of not forgetting that past and understanding that Jewish wisdom has been shaped largely by exile. And that we have to remember that, and we also have to honor our own past and honor all those people who suffered, not to see them just as victims or as people that couldn't act or whatever, but to take their wisdom. And his point was, I think it's the point that I personally believe 1,000%, that the idea of thinking something is fully mine, this is my place, I think always carries with it a great danger. There always has to be a sense that it's not fully mine, it's God's. But last week's Torah reading, the land is mine, we are it. Talks about sukkahs, the idea of you have a home, but you leave every so often from your home to understand it's never fully yours. So I think that's my understanding of Yirmiyahu's Rachel's Baderech. The fact of the matter is that we need someone who represents the idea of not having a place. And that's what Rachel, and that person who doesn't have a place can also appreciate people who don't have a place. It's Rachel who is Mavaka Abonera, who's waiting for her children to return. She understands what it means not to have a place because she has no place. She's Baderech. She's the only one. Everybody else has their place. So the idea of being Baderech to me has a positive side. So I just was reading him the last couple of days about that. I'm quite familiar with him, but the point is, I think that's a really important point. Not getting into any kinds of politics. I think when people think this is mine to the exclusion of everybody else, is when you get into all kinds of problems. And you forget what the Torah says in last week's Parsha, basically. It's not really ever fully yours. The land is mine. It's the way it returns in the Yovel. It's not yours. So to keep that in mind, so Rachel, I think, is a counterbalance in some sense to to the idea of it's fully mine. Of course, in addition to that, there's another point about Leah and Rachel, which is if you have to choose one of them to be with Yaakov, it is very striking that it's Leah and not Rachel. At the end of the day, the main institutions of Israel come from Leah. They don't come from Rachel. In terms of think about Israel, what they are actually, in terms of the political side, the kingship, the priesthood, more from Leah. Rachel, Joseph may be the most brilliant. At the end of the day, he's always secondary. The kingship is Judah. It's not Joseph. The priesthood is Levi. It's not Joseph. So the fact of the matter is, that's what I would say in terms of how it's perceived later on, Yirmiyahu, of Rachel Mevaka Abonela, and Dafka not having a place. Dafka being Baderech, which I think it's a very important point, actually, in terms of not just contemporary thinking, but in general, religious thinking. It's never fully ours. And that's, I think, what the Torah screams out in so many different places. It's yours to the degree you realize it's not yours. I would say that's my formulation. To the extent you realize it's not fully yours, it can be yours. It can be achuza. It's achuza because every 50 years you bring redemption to the land and you let it go. Then it can be yours. If you think it's fully yours, you think you're God, basically, and that's a non-starter for the Chumash. Anybody else with a comment? Thank you for that question. But the Ramban addressed it right on the spot. The Ramban puts it in terms of two sisters. That's the Ramban. Yeah. Anybody else with a comment or question? So yes.
Is it possible that there's an allusion to this in Vayishtachu Yisrael al Rosh Hamitah, that you would have thought he's bowing to Joseph, but the essence is that it's a negation as well of the dream, that it's just to the Rosh Hamitah, which means it's not you, it's God.
Well, I think so you can read it as he's bowing down to the fact that he's thanking God, perhaps, that he's been able to convince his son Joseph I think the issue over here is that can Yaakov convince Yosef about, they have two different ways to see the world, as we'll get to in a minute, but can Yaakov convince Yosef what his true mission is? And I think that the beginning of it is the first statement, Mitzrayim is not for me. Mitzrayim is not a good place. We have a different destiny. I think that's important. So you can read bowing on Rosh Hamitah, not necessarily. I emphasize to Joseph, and sort of the irony. He's bowing down to Joseph, having agreed to do what Yaakov commands him to do, which we would understand very well would not be something that Joseph would necessarily want to do. First, it's not easy for Joseph to do it. He's the viceroy of Egypt. He's the viceroy of Egypt. He's the vice president of the land. He's going to bury his father outside the land. So that's not simple for Joseph. But yes, it can be read also, I think, as thanksgiving to God for the fact that at least this first step is Yosef has agreed and he swears. I think that's solely a way to read it. Of course, the deeper question here is the issue in the story is Yaakov versus Yosef, and that we'll start with now, and we'll hopefully finish it next week. And then when we resume the next set of sessions, there's still plenty to do here, and then we'll start Sefer Shemot, I'm hoping. So now,
David?
Yes.
I was thinking that the idea that you've been saying about that when you realize that it's not really yours is when you have legitimacy to it.
Yes.
Has been brought out. You brought it out with Akedat Yitzchak, that just at the moment when Abraham realizes that it's not his, Hashem says, Ki lo chasachta et bincha et yechidcha.
Yes, right.
And you also made that claim with David, that when
Yes,
David, so
Right.
it's the same theme that
Right.
keeps.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, but with Gan Eden, we're expelled from Gan Eden because people might think they're God. And that's always dangerous. People think they're God. It always leaves us in a bad way. So, no, for sure. It's something, I think it's based, it starts with Gan Eden. I think it's really one of the central motifs of our Tanakh. Comes up with Avram, with David, and here as well. Other places also. I think it's one of those things that It comes up in different forms, but it's the core idea, I think, is the same. That's for sure. All right, let me continue now. So, fine. Now we have the following. We'll start this now. This stuff is very, very, very rich stuff over here. Fine. Bayar Yisrael, we're up to the 8th pasuk. Bayar Yisrael b'nei Yosef, Vayomer mi'ela. Very strange verse. Yaakov, who just said, Menashe and Ephraim are going to be mine, he sees these two children standing in front of him. He says, who are these? Mi'ela. Who are these children? Mi'ela. He doesn't know. Vayomer Yosef el aviv bonayhem. Asher notanu Elohim bazeh. These are my children that God has given me here. Bazeh. They're born here in Egypt. Vayomar, and Yaakov says, Kochem no elai b'avrochem, bring them to me, so I should bless them. I may bless them. Now, I just wanted to reflect upon these two verses for a moment. First of all, what do you mean mi'ela? Why does the Chumash have this over here? So I think two ways to understand mi'ela, but one way to understand it is that the Chumash is really raising here a question. We know Yaakov is very old, and Yaakov wants to bless his grandchildren. But we remember when you read about a parent blessing a child or giving a blessing, and the story we all remember is the story of Yitzchak blessing Yaakov. And that story also, Yitzchak says he's very old, he may die any day. And he instructs his son Esav to come. And there he actually can't see. His eyes are dim. We'll get to that. That's the one more pasuk. The next verse number 10. And Israel's eyes were dim with age. He could not see. Yitzchak could see dimly. Yaakov can't see at all. He brings them close. He kisses them and he hugs them. This reminds us of the story of Yitzchak in chapter 27. He can't see who's standing in front of him. He suspects it might not be Esav. So he smells the coat, and he said the voice is the voice of Jacob. He's hearing the voice, he's smelling the coat. He comes in close, he touches him, all the other senses, because he can't see. And there he blesses the wrong child, as it were, the child that he thought was actually Esav, it's Yaakov. And now the Chumash is raising the question for us. How much does Yaakov know? The Chumash sets up for the reader a question, because it says he can't see it all, and he just said, who are these children? What do you mean? Just say he doesn't know who they are? Who are these children? He just said Ephraim and Menashe are going to be like Reuben and Shimon. So now we have a question: how much does he actually understand? How much does he actually know? And it's actually amplified by the pasuk number 11. Vayomer Yisrael el Yosef, Rio fanecha lo filoti. Says I never either hoped for or determined I would see your face. I was never sure I would see your face. And behold, God has let me see your children as well. But of course, we just were told he can't see. Verse number 10 says, he can't see. So what does it mean in verse number 11? He says, I hadn't even thought I would see you, and where you now, I can even see them. So can he see or can't he see? That's the question. That's the question the Chumash, I think, wants to be. It sets up a certain tension over here. What does Yaakov see? Remember, to see is also to understand and to perceive. So how much does Yaakov know? How much does Yaakov not know? The Chumash raises it as a question, because he's about to do something very strange, which can be interpreted as he's making a mistake. He just doesn't know what he's doing. Or no, or does the one who can see actually see very well? That's the question. Now, there's more to these psukim. We'll have to wait for next week. But this is at least is the question. Now, there's something else over here, going back again to that earlier pasuk, which is what, 8 or 9 over there. Yosef is what Yaakov sees that there were two, dimly can see that there were two children with Yosef. Vayomer mi'ela. Who are these children? Mi'ela. So you can read it as, who are they? He doesn't know who they are. Or you could also read it another way, which is, I'm not suggesting what I've said till now is not right. I do believe it's correct, that the Chumash sets up a certain question. It heightens the drama. But Mi'e was asking another question. Reminds me in the book of Ruth, when Ruth comes back from Boaz, she sends Ruth to lie down at midnight next to Boaz. And Ruth returns back early in the morning. And Naomi says to Ruth, Mi at biti, who are you, my daughter? What does it mean, who are you, my daughter? She knows Ruth. I mean, who are you? Who are you means something else. She's asking, who are you? Are you Ruth or are you Mrs. Boaz? In other words, who are you? She knows who she is, but what is your actual status? That's what Naomi asked Ruth. She came back after midnight next to what happened. What is your status now? Having gone in the middle of the night, lying down next to Boaz, who are you? What is your status? And over here, I think one can read the same question. Who are these children? Who are these children? The oldest one is named Forgetful. So I could forget my past and my father's house. So what Yaakov is concerned about is these children born in Egypt, before I got here, he says, before I got here, who are they? Are they the children of Joseph? Or maybe the kids of Tzafnas Paneach? Who are they? So Yaakov's not sure who they are. Yaakov says, you bring them to me. I'm going to bless them. I'm going to bless them. I'm going to tell them who they are, because they may not know who they are. And once they hear who they are, the other ones will be fine. But I want to bless them. And we remember, of course, that since we're recalling the blessing of Yitzchak to Esau, Yaakov, that's the blessing of a father to a son. So it really reinforces what Yaakov said to Yosef, which is remarkable. Ki Ruvain v'Shimon, these are like my children. Not only in theory, but in practice, I'm going to bless them as a father blesses his children. So that's the fun. So now let's just continue a little bit more over here. And we'll have to, one more puzzle, and next week we'll pick up the story. Verse number 12. Vayotze Yosef otam me'im birkav, vayishtachu li'apav arza. Joseph removed them from his knees, birkav, and bowed low. Vayishtachu li'apav arza. He bowed low with his face to the ground. Now, who's bowing down? It sounds like Joseph is bowing down before his father. Earlier, the father bowed down to Joseph in the context of Joseph obeying his father. And here, it sounds like Joseph is truly bowing down, acceding to his father's request, which borders on the chutzpah, which is, I take them away from you and I'm going to bless them. Notice something else over here. Now, I'll stop with this point. Next week, we'll begin with the blessing of Menashe and Ephraim. Get as far as we can get it. There's a lot to say here. But first of all, there's a play here on Me'im Birkav. Joseph takes them off Birkav to bring them over to Jacob, who is Avorchem, who's going to bless them. So there's a sense of Joseph sort of relinquishing his control. And remember that the idea of a berech, a knee, right? The idea of the knee, you have it, the idea of the knee is something to do with also with we have the word, we have gene, progeny, right? Genus is a knee. So the idea of Joseph relinquishing his parenthood, at least temporarily, later he's going to get them back. You'll do al birkei Yosef. What you have over here in the story, and this is what is remarkable, is that Yaakov is making a claim on these grandchildren as his own children to the extent he's going to bless them the way he wants. That's going to be the fight. And that Yosef is agreeing to this and is relinquishing them now. Yosef probably couldn't realize fully what Yaakov has in mind, because he will object to what Yaakov does. We know that Yaakov famously will move his right hand on the head of Ephraim and the left hand on the head of Menashe. We'll talk about that next week. There's a lot to say about that. This is one of the great stories in Sefer Bereshit because it brings together all kinds of themes that have emerged throughout the book. And here they come into play together. There's several of them. We'll talk about this next week. Or this is a certain way of almost a culminating story of the book. But here you have Vayotze Me'im Birkav, Vayishtachu Li'apav Arza. So here, let me just stop at this point and take a couple of comments or questions. And next week we'll continue and complete the set of classes with the with the story of Menashe and Ephraim, the blessing of Menashe and Ephraim, hopefully finish chapter 48 if possible. So let me just take a couple of comments or questions and we'll stop. Happy Mother's Day to all. And let me take comments or questions. Is there anything in the chat or anything, Lillian? Is there anything there?
There's nothing in the chat just now. To remind people, feel free to unmute and ask your question or put it in the chat and I will read it out.
Can I just say that I thought your comment, the way that you draw the parallels and the analysis from one, I just thought it was thrilling, exciting.
Okay, thank
Linking
you.
the way that you link every, it's fascinating how you draw from the text.
It's one of the culminating stories of the book. And the truth of the matter is, what I think quite amazing about this book is that on one hand, the Joseph story, if you read the Joseph, it feels different than the rest of it. It reads like a novel, actually. But on the other hand, what the book does, it is somehow the Joseph story is so basically embedded in Sefer Bereshit that many of the larger themes of Sefer Bereshit are going to play out. Next week, if we have, hopefully get to it next week and try to demonstrate some of the really core themes of Sefer Bereshit in terms of Yaakov's life, Yaakov and Esau, Yitzchak and Yishmael, Lavan, how they all come into play here in the Joseph story. So you really have a sense it's fully part of the story. And it is, in fact, the culminating story of Sefer Bereshit. That is the end of the book. So hopefully next week we'll have a chance to look at that carefully. And also start with Menashe and Ephraim and look carefully at it and this conflict of Yaakov and Yosef, the disagreement, And there are two giants over here, there's the viceroy, the brilliant viceroy of Egypt, and there's the old father who can barely see, And that's the, but who sees everything, of course. We'll have to stop here at this point. So okay. So looking forward to next week to complete the sessions with you. And okay, thank you all.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank
And
you.
happy
you. Have a
Mother's
great
Day
day.
to Devorah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Toda.
Thank you, Rabbi Silber, so much. And thank you, everyone in our learning community, for your amazing comments and questions, as always. A few quick Drisha announcements before we end. As a reminder, next week's session will be the final one for this term, which means there will likely be an encore or a reprise of some sort in order to finish Genesis. I'm sure we're all happy and excited for that to come back next month. As a reminder, the virtual summer Kollel's applications deadline is tomorrow, so get those applications in. If you enjoy learning online with Drisha and have a bit more time this summer, we're going to have a lovely Gemara share every morning with Rabbi Dan Margulies and a variety of evening and afternoon and some evening classes. You can find out about all these programs, register, more information at drisha.org, and a happy Mother's Day to everyone celebrating.